Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an Institute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast are to provide some introductory remarks to Oswald Spengler and the decline of the West. This will be followed, as schedules allow, this particular week of recording, by a live discussion, please God. This is week 6 of 10 of our cycles course, properly called the Sons of Issachar. And we spent the last several weeks looking at perennialist looks at history, Abrahamistic ones. We've looked at St. Augustine and Ibn Khaldun. We've looked at Giambattista Vico and Hegel. We've gotten into great literature like the Muqaddimah, the Civitas Dei, other historiographical books. We've had fun with endless charts on Hegel and all sorts of good things besides. You can see some of the previous introductory remarks on this beautiful Cycles class website, our docs website. Again, the course is entitled The Sons of Issachar. And the best way to support this work is to enroll in our classes. We're having Giving Week here at ApocatastasisInstitute, where I'm kicking myself in the behind to ask you to donate, ask you to buy our books, ask you especially to enroll in our classes. And these are all great ways to move this work forward. There are very real operating expenses that myself and the other teachers here have, not the least of which is bandwidth. And the more material capital we have, the more serious scholars we can get I think we've moved out of the volunteer-only aspect of apocatastasis. It only took 12 years, but let me tell you, it's a different psychology when you're working with volunteers. And I can also tell you, when people have monetary compensation, they take things a lot more seriously. So anyway, please consider donating to Apocatastasis, and especially appropriate to this advertisement, please consider enrolling in one of our courses, including our cycles class, our Sons of Issachar course. Okie dokie. So off to the races now, looking at some introductory thoughts. And where I like to begin is usually with the previous week's scholar. So we're looking at Oswald Spengler today. We have two, I don't know if caricatures is the right word, but two cartoons or sketches of the men. Oswald Spengler is your stone-bald gentleman on the left of the screen. And then George Friedrich Hegel is on the right. Crazy eyes have been rather muted here. I think here on the class cycles, you can see in painted Technicolor what one artist thought of his eyes. So those are called crazy eyes. And all right. But Hegel, in any case, is a man I already alluded to, that we consider having lots of charts and so forth. He's a favorite of Marxists with his so-called Hegelian dialectics, the synthesis, the antithesis, and then, or rather the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis, and rinse and repeat, and that is history. For Hegel, last week's figure, and you can see the recording on the Cycles class to get up to date with your man. For Hegel, he is a man of the Enlightenment, solidly so. He is a man who sees all of history and all of human life in a progress upward, spiritual improvement, technological improvement, political refinement, and so forth. For Hegel, everything is moving in a certain direction. And that had to do with both the 18th century into the 19th century when Hegel was living. And it also especially had to do with the French Revolution, this titanic energy, one of the most important events in European history. It would certainly be in the top 5 major events from, we'll say, the caveman days until today that you must know about Western history is the French Revolution, without a doubt. Nobody will doubt that. And I don't make such absolute statements, but the significance of the French Revolution is hard to exaggerate. And for Hegel, that was certainly the case. And he saw with things like the National Assembly deposing the monarchy, a monarchy that had ruled France for over 1,000 years, with the Levée en masse, the conscript army of the French Republic, destroying the mercenary armies of the rest of Europe. The rational idea of administration versus the catch can type of medieval mindset that was being displaced. Not the least of which, as I've referred to before, the displacement of the Christian priesthood with the legal, secular, commercial priesthood, a literal changing of the guard at the Treaty of Westphalia a couple generations before Hegel. Right? Who are the new priests going to be in the Enlightenment world? They're not going to be your Catholic priest or your Orthodox priest on the corner. Nobody cares about them. Right? If they have a fasting day, you don't care. But by Willikers, if an attorney gives you a speeding ticket, you pay it. I pay it. Right? Who has authority? Well, who you're not going to cross. There was a time when you would not cross the Christian priest or the Christian bishop. There was a time when you cared about being excommunicated. There was a time when you cared about the regulations of the church. I speak of you as Western man. Now, in the Enlightenment, we tremble over tax bills, fines, points on our license, right? This is the new priesthood that we're enjoying. I say that with every ounce of sarcasm. Hegel seeing this change, and I dare say the new priesthood wasn't quite as obnoxious as it became, and so it all did seem very progressive. And just one final point, and this is appropriate to Hegel's philosophy and the whole gist of what I'm trying to lay out, the Geist, the ghost of what I'm trying to lay out, very Hegelian, mind you. Look at the previous religious priesthood, right? It's based off of inherently unscientific, unprovable in terms of hard data, claims of grace and God and providence, and you can't weigh and measure these things. It's part of their appeal, I think. Even the new, perhaps obnoxious, legal banking priesthood after Westphalia, it is predicated, at least, on cognizable, logical, rational lines, right? If you have a sin on your soul, there is not inherently it's not always clear to the individual why, if they ate meat on Friday, they're in a state of sin. If I get a speeding ticket and I now own a fine, okay, there's at least some logical mechanism at play there. It's a little bit easier to understand. There was a rule, allegedly, and I broke it. So we can see a contrast between the old medieval system and then this new so-called enlightened system. Hegel's looking at all of this, and he comes up with his theory, once again, of thesis, antithesis. One idea, the contrary idea, they come into conflict and something else is born. So within the Enlightenment, you had the French Revolution. Within the French Revolution, you had the final chapter concerning Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a fascinating figure for Hegel, and I think for any student of history, is, without being silly, a conservative radical. Napoleon Bonaparte is absolutely a man of the French Revolution, and yet he is also a man who knows how this world works, and he knows that this French Revolution that he is steering, and he is, in a sense, has inherited, and in a sense, as I tell the high schoolers, takes on the road like a band goes on the road. Napoleon takes the French Revolution on the road and very much understands his role as doing that in Spain, in Italy, in Egypt, in Central Europe, ultimately, infamously, in Russia. Wherever Napoleon goes, they literally plant liberty trees. Wherever Napoleon goes, there are scientists weighing and measuring and translating and canonizing the literature of the peoples that he comes across. This is very French revolutionary. And yet Napoleon understands realpolitik. He understands he can't do what Robespierre did and the Jacobins when they had control of the French Revolution before Thermidor, which ultimately led to Napoleon's rise. Napoleon knows he cannot declare war on every king in the world, and Napoleon has no time of day for statements like the Jacobins had. We will strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. Napoleon has no time for this, yet he is a radical. And for this example, Hegel sees all that he needs to know about his historical vision. He sees in Napoleon, right, you have the thesis, the altar and throne, pre-revolutionary, medieval, monarchical Christian world. You have the antithesis, the exact opposite, the secular, at times atheistic, deistic, Freemasonic French Revolution. They come into direct conflict in France. France never had a Reformation that lasted. I'm being very careful here. France very nearly did become Calvinist, but it was a real struggle, not in the way that ultimately happened in Germany or England. There's a little back and forth. In France, it really was a true tug of war between the old Catholic Church and the Calvinist Church. Ultimately, the Calvinists lost and came to America, for instance, the Huguenots. Anyway, that means when you have the French Revolution, you have a direct conflict between medieval Christianity. In fact, you could argue that Christianity in France was more medieval than the mainstream official Catholicism of the 18th century. France never implemented, until well after the French Revolution, the reforms of the Council of Trent. That's a whole other discussion. The point is, France is almost religiously and psychologically in amber. I think there's a new Jurassic Park coming out pretty soon. So everywhere I'm turning on the internet and on the TV, they have references to Jurassic Park, which is how I know they're going to do another sequel, I reckon, pretty soon. Anyway, if you've seen the first Jurassic Park, you know the mosquito and amber scene at the beginning. That's France in the eve of the French Revolution, and that comes in direct conflict with a very different worldview already described. What does that produce? It produces in one man Napoleon. And so this is all very, very illustrative for Hegel. Okay, that's just a recounting of last class. Always want to anchor ourselves. When it comes to Oswald Spengler, we're back to a figure which is a lot like, to 2 weeks from this recording, Giambattista Vico and his Scienza Nuova, his new science, with Spengler here in his glorious stone-bald head somewhere. There we go. Here with Spengler, we go back to, shall we say, a conservative view of history, a pessimistic, perhaps, view of history, certainly a cyclical view, certainly not a linear view of history. So Spengler is very much like Vico, and to a certain extent Ibn Khaldun, in his cyclical understanding of history. He is dissimilar to the likes of whoever wrote the books of Chronicles in the Holy Bible, St. Augustine, Hegel. We'll get to Benner, by the way. I'm not forgetting about Samuel Benner. We'll do Benner, don't worry. I'm not forgetting. But in any case, well, before we get on to Spengler, just one other aside. You know what they say about bald people. As a balding fellow myself, what do they say about bald people? That their brains are working so hard that it burns off the hair on their head. And I love that for its flattering humor. So I think with Spengler, that might be the case. Spengler was a school teacher and then became something of a reclusive scholar in later life. And maybe his brain was working so overtime, it actually did burn out the hair follicles. Okay, so to understand Spengler, I think the easiest thing to do, and this is just something I'm blatantly ripping off from another presentation, but the quote's been attributed to all sorts of people, including Fulton Sheen, that if you steal from one person, that's called plagiarism and it's wrong. But if you steal from many people, that's called research and it's okay. So I'll say I researched this. In any case, Spengler's view of history is like a basket or a net or whatever container you please of whatever fruit you please. If you don't like oranges, I don't care. I had very tasty pears, not pears. They call them prunes. I think they were plums. I need to look up the difference, but I had a few plums or prunes this morning. You could have bananas. You could put passion fruit in there. If you Orientals watching this, you can put your durian. Durian's a very smelly fruit they have in South Central, Southeast Asia. Durian, very stinky. I used to bring it into the school for the kids. Kind of just a fun thing to do. Or go over to the Oriental Market in West Hartford. Whatever fruit you want, to understand Spengler, you need to understand this image. And that is to say, for Spengler, each civilization is its own contained unit. It is only by random happenstance that some appear before others. So Spengler's view of history, which is fundamentally cyclical, bucks up very much against a type of history which almost everyone watching this was taught. All of us with varying shades of difference, inherited a generally Enlightenment, or shall we say, Whig understanding of history. There are various reasons for that, not the least of which is that basically what's taught in grade school in America and even in college is about 100 years out of date, literally in every subject. If you actually look at what's being presented as the established science, literally natural science, you're just rehashing things from 100 years old. Some of the things that are taught in natural science have actually they were out of date in the 1920s, and they're still being taught. Anyway, the same is true for history. And frankly, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, especially in the English-speaking world, especially in these United States, for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is these United States are an Enlightenment project. We inherited a very linear understanding of history. And that is basically what all of us were taught. And there are shades of difference, whether you were homeschooled or went to some private school, you went to some Muslim school, you went to public school, it doesn't matter. We basically were all taught a linear, progressive understanding of history. Spengler says nonsense to that. It was total happenstance that Rome occurred before Greece or the Holy Roman Empire or the Caliphate or the Ming Chinese or the Americans or whatever. It's all, to understand civilizations, you have to understand that they all go through the same cycles, but what moves them, to use Hegel's phrase, is a certain Geist. But the Geist always goes through the same stages. It's only random, it's only apparent, not actual, that civilization is moving in this progressive trajectory. You might have spurts of technological innovation, which this society is enjoying as of this recording, but technologies are forgotten. Sure, you can put in a canal right now. Gaza has basically been bulldozed. Well, one of the main reasons Gaza has been bulldozed is because the Arabs and the Israelis want to put in a giant canal from the Gulf of Aqaba right through Gaza. That's the outlet for this canal that's going to compete with the Suez Canal. Oh, wow, the Suez Canal, what a 19th century marvel of technology. Except that it isn't. It is, but it's not the first time it was done. There was an ancient Suez Canal there. Technology can be forgotten. If NASA is to be believed, with a great giant heaping of salt, we America have forgotten how to send a man on the moon. If you believe that, I have some beachfront property in Utah to sell you. But in any case, we do know that technologies are in fact lost, and sometimes they're replaced. Their alleged technological improvement is replaced by something that actually is inferior. For instance, and this is the last example before we get to some articles. For instance, the VHS was initially replaced by a superior technology called Laserdisc. Most people watching this have never heard of Laserdisc because we remember CDs. CDs are a cruddier technology. They can hold much less, but for various reasons, including portability, they triumphed over the larger, more technically competent Laserdisc. Right before Laserdisc, actually, the analog cassette, went through an improvement that very quickly was sidelined, where you could put a lot more data onto the film. The film turns to dust after a few years and breaks down and becomes very, very unreliable, so it doesn't really matter. But the point is, technologies can progress and regress. And so, contra Hegel, contra the Enlightenment, contra what we were taught, Oswald Spengler is not going to hang his hat on alleged political developments. He's very negative about the concept of liberalism or democracy. He sees it really as a sign of degeneracy, and when the money power comes to to its position, which is that's nothing new. I mean, Plato has this idea. So you ought to be, by the week 6 in this course, discerning 2 different camps, broadly speaking: the linear camp of historical improvement, which you can take back to the ancient world in different ways, and then the cyclical. And then you have shades of difference between the two. For instance, and this is very interesting for Spengler, Western Christianity, in a sense, what comes to be called Catholicism, incorporates both a linear and a cyclical understanding of history. And I could go on about this, but let's get into some articles here. Again, this is Oswald Spengler, and this is his book, Der Untergang des Abendlandes. The downfall of the West, I believe it's translated, the decline of the West. So this is his book. Now, this book ended up selling quite a bit in the 1920s. Why do you think this German book sold so much in the 1920s? Well, because Germany is going through a great deal of tribulation at that time. The Diktat had been enforced upon it. Germany had lost the First World War. And you say, so what? People lose wars all the time. People win wars all the time. What we have to remember is that in the 19th century, up through the First World War, even to the very last weeks of the First World War, Germany was ahead of the game. Throughout the 19th century, even, speaking of Hegel, throughout and even before the 19th century, Germany was the center of culture, philosophy, religion, everything. And as I say, really up until the late summer of 1918, it very clearly looked like Germany was going to win. And then you can chop it up different ways, but the country became exhausted, or the population became exhausted, and you have the so-called Black Day of the German army when Hindenburg informs, I'm blanking, Kaiser Wilhelm, that the war cannot be won by the late summer, I think sometime in August or September. This is the Black Day of the German army. And Germany cannot win the war. It cannot lose. It has not lost the war by the fall of 1918, but it can no longer possibly win the war. And so it collapses, exhausted, and is carved up and is humiliated at the Treaty of Versailles. And so anyway, in the 1920s, a lot of Germans are wondering, how could this happen? If we were ahead of the game, how could there be this exhaustion and this humiliation thereafter? So that helps to explain why Der Untergang des Abendlandes was so successful. That was not a bad pronunciation, if I do say so myself. Okay, so let's get into some points here. And okay, so it's interesting because Spengler has had a revival of sorts in the last 10 years, particularly on the dissident right, and in what we used to call maybe 10 years ago the alt-right, when the alt-right people still read books. There's one figure who's actually kind of become mainstream, and I do not think this man has ever read a non-political book. He could stand to take a few classes at ApocatastasisInstitute. And I've not even been on the camera. How have you survived this long without old John Coleman on the camera? All right. Wow, I'm sure your life is so much better now. All right. Obviously, the person I'm thinking of who's gone mainstream from what was called the alt-right is Nick Fuentes. And I have not heard that man, a man who has said many sensible things, I have not heard him make any literary, spiritual, cultural references. He, like a lot of us, he has a very, very pronounced bandwidth of a very limited sphere of politics and political history going back about 5 years. And beyond that, it's terra incognito. So There was a time when the dissident right actually read books, and Spengler was dug up about 10 years ago. So he has gone through a renaissance in our day. And we read, again, going back to Hegel and reading him, the author says, with a bit more subtlety than I was wont to before, I am finding that he is indeed a much more complicated thinker than many of his conservative critics, even the Russian ones, allege. This is a Russian Orthodox site. This is a Western man who belongs to that religion, incidentally. This much is true. Hegel did believe that history had a progressive direction, and he did believe that we are moving towards truth. But he did not buy so wholly into the Whiggish myth of progress as some might imagine. Whig history in the English-speaking world is this idea of progressive history, particularly around the idea of English liberty. So a true Whig historian would, focus on England and look at the Roman influence, and look, the British drove out the Romans, or at the very least, the Roman culture never really sunk in deep until it came back with Christianity. And then, look at the Magna Carta, and look at the English Reformation, and look at the English Civil War. And the whole point of Whig history is to paint this idea of the entire saga of English life being this constant progression towards liberty. But when you use the term Whig history in a larger sense, you mean just general progressive history. Hegel didn't proclaim an end of history. Hegel did not pretend to know what the truth was, or what was unfolding of the logos in history would look like, even if in his more characteristic moments he imagined that the German nation, what with its refined sense of social responsibility and its balanced constitutional Prussian monarchy, might, at some point in the future, attain to it. Also, the commonly perpetuated idea of his system consisting of a triad, here we go, of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, in a continuous upbuilding form, is not actually Hegel's, but Fichte's. This triad plays no role in Hegel's philosophy of history. For Hegel, the progress by which the logos unfolds in history is swathed in the mystical, much like Hölderlin's is. And it is incomprehensible except in retrospect. I suspect, speaking myself here, that it's the Marxists who kind of stripped or simplified Hegel to this more mechanistic way that was being critiqued just now. When philosophy paints its gray in gray, one form of life has become old, and by means of gray in gray, it cannot be rejuvenated, but only known. The owl of Minerva, very famous Hegelian phrase, begins its flight only when the shades of twilight are gathering. Hegel's philosophy of history does posit an objective dimension, something which is not seen in the ontological grounding of the historiographies of Liam Schuming and Oswald Spengler. Liam Schuming's fundamental understanding of the workings of the cosmos, his metaphysics and ontology, was Buddhist, derived from Yogacara, and had as its basis profound consciousness of the impermanence of any singular truth. Spengler's ontological grounding was derived from Goethe and Nietzsche, and had an existentialist dimension. He agreed with Liang in his consciousness of impermanence of truth, but also claimed that the truth was something which had to inhere in the great man in history. They have a similar form, however, to Hegel's. Hegel does find within the tragedies of history the birth and life of civilizations. Steps towards this truth. Hegel's reason may be cosmopolitan, universal, absolute, but concrete instances through which this reason proceeds are entirely subjective. And here he is actually more in agreement with Spengler and Liang than he is with the rationalist and optimist like Kant. Hegel had little truck with democratic peace theory in his day. He would have far less with the neoconservative fever dreams of an eternal Pax Americana, despite some of these people attempting to claim him for themselves. You'll recall from a previous class the reference of Francis Fukuyama and his book, which was obliquely referenced here. His book was entitled The End of History. Fukuyama was and is, I believe, teaching at Georgetown. He's still teaching. Whether or not it's at Georgetown, I don't quite recall. But when he was, I think, in graduate school or early on teaching at Georgetown 20, 30 years ago, right after the Gulf War, 30 years ago, I guess now, he wrote this book which made quite a splash called The End of History. So just like Marxists use Hegel, well, guess what? So do neoconservative so-called capitalists. Of course, at the end of the day, the neocons are just a faction of communists, but that's another discussion. Even if he did not use this triad, which is famously the wrongly attributed to him, Hegel saw recent unfolding in history through successions of historical stages, and each one containing the seeds of its own destruction. This is something that Marx, by the way, borrowed directly from his teacher, and never really revised, even when he stood Hegel on his head. It is to Hegel's credit that his understanding of this unfolding did not shy away from instances of historical tragedy. So, Spengler, to our man today, this week, approaches history from a similar direction, but he radicalizes the imperfection of human reason when he cites Goethe and his philosophy of becoming. Let's stop there in case you're unfamiliar, right? This is not Goethe. This is not Goethe. You're going to take a class, you got to learn how to pronounce things. So this is Goethe. I don't know where the R is coming from. You got me? But that's how it's pronounced. Goethe. In fact, preparing for this, I heard Nietzsche referred to as Nietzsche. So anyway, pronunciation matters. Okay. In fact, an iteration of Platonic philosophy, an inspiration for his approach to history by focusing entirely on the specific, the concrete, the living expression of culture. In other words, rather than on fixed principles which offer him the forms of non-living, Spengler is adapting a skeptical, non-objective ontology similar to Liang Shuming's yogic dharmism, and in a more attenuated way to Constantine Leontiev's highly stylized and aestheticized Byzantianism. The wry echoes of Friedrich Nietzsche in the thought of all three men are not accidental. But there is another unacknowledged source for this ontology. Spengler begins describing time in ways that carry eerie echoes of his French contemporary Henri Bergson. Spengler comes to strikingly similar conclusions to Bergson in L'Évolution créatrice about the ways in which the intuitive approach to history, which he prefers, is at odds with a mechanical rationating, frame by frame historical analysis. Get back, this is what you pay for, right? This is, you come for Spengler, you stay for the oranges. When you want to understand Spengler, understand the bag of fruit. Each fruit, right, each civilization, get it, is organized on its own particular spirit, and because mankind shares many qualities, necessarily the societies of mankind will go through their own cycles with that spirit. So there is no movement towards a universal truth, a universal kind of secularized logos that you see in Hegel. Rather, these same, the same stages we can palpitate from Plato, already mentioned, or St. Augustine, or Ibn Khaldun. But for Spengler, there is not a final end point, which Hegel kind of secularized from Abrahamism. We know, this is from, I believe, The Decline of the West. We know it to be true of every organism that the rhythm, form, and duration of its life, and all the expression details of that life as well, are determined by the properties of its species. Notice, by the way, all of these dudes, going back to the 18th century and into the 20th, are all drawing conclusions, whether it's pro-enlightenment or anti-enlightenment. They're all making points about history from the natural world. So You can even see this in Diderot during the French Revolution or right before with his Encyclopédie, looking at the role of weather and climate in terms of being a major factor in the rise and fall of peoples. No one, continuing with Spengler, looking at the oak with its millennial life, dare say that it is at this moment, now, about to start on its true and proper course. No one, as he sees a caterpillar grow day by day, expects that it will go on doing so for 2 or 3 years. In these cases, we feel with an unqualified certainty a limit, and this sense of the limit is identical with our sense of the inward form. In the case of higher human history, on the contrary, we take our ideas as the course of the future from an unbridled optimism that sets at naught all historical, that is to say, organic experience, and everyone therefore sets himself to discover, in the accidental present terms, that he can expand into some striking progression series, an existence of which rests not on scientific proof, but on prediction, or rather predilection. 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 Back to the oranges. So, we had another simile from nature, the caterpillar or rock. You know, these things go through cycles. Rocks are created oftentimes by volcanoes and whatnot, and different plates smashing up into each other. And then they, in the longest sense possible, probably. By the way, speaking of rocks, here's Spengler's grave. Interesting, the black cube. Altogether interesting. Notice his life is 1880 to 1930, so he lives through, he was born into the high period of German creativity, through the First World War, through the chaos of the 20s. Again, his book is a great seller in Germany and elsewhere in the 20s, and then himself dies in 1930, just as Germany is about to embark on another epoch, another chapter at the very least. But anyway, for Spengler, if the orange thing doesn't help you, think of a caterpillar or an insect or an animal, whatever, that you have a deer 1,000 years ago, a deer now, a deer in 1,000 years from now. They all go through the same cycles, but it's completely random where one lives over chronologically compared to another. And you say, okay, well, a deer's an animal, and so then their pattern, or the bug for that matter, they're going to be very cookie cutter. But look at civilizations. This is the counter argument to Spengler. Look at civilizations. They're very different. For Spengler, what's moving them, what makes Rome different than the Ming Chinese, different from us now, is an internal spirit. It's an internal genius, as you like, an internal DNA. We have to do analogies to make sense of all this. This is a rather abstract thinking altogether. There's an internal energy that explains the life cycles of civilizations. It could be, for Spengler, that a group of people arises with the exact or very similar focus of Rome, or of some of the African kingdoms, or whatever, take your pick. In which instance, they would have a civilization like Wakanda or something, or Shaka Zulu. If you could approximate the same spirit that moved the Greeks, you would start seeing the same fruits. As it happens, Spengler describes our Western civilization as Faustian, and we tend to be focused on progress, and so that's given us, it's given us our, for instance, technological insight. For Spengler, there's a whole artistic meditation on Spengler. Why is it that the Greeks and the Romans had such a focus on statuary, And why in their pottery, for instance, there seems to be endless amounts of Greek pottery. Why are there no horizons? Why is there no sky? Why, in fact, don't they seem to have the color blue in their descriptions? Why is the sea called the wine red sea in the Iliad again and again and again and again? For Spengler, this actually represents the soul of the Greeks. The Greeks see the immediate, they see the body. Their gods are just giant people, effectively. Right? Why don't the Greek pottery have mountains in the background? Because the Greeks don't see the reality. I mean, they physically can see the mountains, but it doesn't factor into their interpretation of reality. What does is the body, the individual. Likewise, in later Western civilization, when the West took Christianity, and for Spengler, it turns it into a completely different thing than original Semitic Christianity, or what he calls Magian civilization. Christianity kind of takes the form of Magian Christianity, but pumps in its own focus, including and this is Faust and the idea, this is Spengler and the idea of the Faustine civilization, the civilization that's always looking off to the horizon, always testing the bounds. So for Spengler, he's impressed that Western art has horizon, has perspective, has a landscape. For Spengler, these aren't just people dicking around with different artistic styles. For Spengler, these say very concrete things about how civilizations view the world. When the Egyptians, often, almost maybe exclusively in terms of their two-dimensional representations, show people from the side, for Spengler, again, that's indicating how the Egyptians see reality. If you could replicate the circumstances that led to the spirit of the Egyptians, you could have another ancient Egypt. It would be completely random that the fact that the historic ancient Egypt is 3,000 years ago, whatever, 4,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, some people say, and then you have America and the Holy Roman Empire and the Russian Empire. And now you have something like ancient Egypt arising. You could have people in loincloths building however they built those things. But for Spengler, again, getting back to the point, there is no linear progression whatsoever. Each civilization operates with its own spirit through proper cycles, but it's not really going anywhere. There is no Hegelian capital T truth that things are moving towards. There are truths, but not in this meta singular sense. I was originally brought, Spengler says, to reflect on this fundamental question of our world consciousness through noticing how present-day historians, as they fumbled around tangible events, things believe themselves to have already grasped history, the happening, the becoming itself. This is a prejudice common to all who proceed by reason and cognition, as against intuitive perception. Life perpetually fulfilling itself as an element of becoming is what we call the present, not the future for Hegel, right? The present. Life is becoming in the present. We're not moving towards anything. And it possesses that mysterious property of direction by which men have tried to rationalize that by means of the enigmatic word time. Okay. And so the author concludes, we have need for both Hegelianism and Spengler-Bergsonism attitudes towards history. We should never fool ourselves into believing glibly that our current social order is in some way the most important, most moral, most rational. Spengler's bucket of cold water on that conceit is fully warranted, but so are his and Bergson's gentle reminders that we historians are not so much clock winders and calendar tuners as we are custodians of a living garden, as well as of botanical samples that were once alive. Notice again the natural imagery here, and also just the use of simile in general, as we've tried in our course to lay out things. We began the course looking at the historian as map maker. Now we have the historian as botanist, clock winder, calendar tuner, very Enlightenment, mechanistic. I would like to think, the author says, but I cannot know for some time until I finally tackled Hegel's Gelsche Philosophie itself, that wasn't too bad pronunciation, Gelsche Philosophie, that the elder German would agree. Spengler's here and now, present-focused historical consciousness is badly needed in our day, as both liberals and conservatives, so-called, fool themselves into believing we can either reason our way backward to a more rational point of national glory in our past, or reason our way forward painlessly into an ever more liberated, Gnostic, libertine, quote-unquote, woke future. But we can also use a modified Hegelian assurance that there is an end, that our work, even if not complete, does have a certain final form, even and especially if we do not know what that is. Tu autem Domine miserere nobis, adeo gratias. Once again, that article that we've nibbled substantially away at is entitled The Historiophilosophies of Hegel and Spengler Compared. Okay, now we get to culture and civilization, Oswald Spengler's approach to history. And before we take one more step forward, we are going to blow this up. Okay. From the Hungarian conservatives, did you know there was such a thing? Okay. Oswald Spengler was one of the most important German conservative philosophers of the history of the first half of the 20th century. The first volume of his great work, The Decline of the West, was published in 1918. Wow, what a year for Germany. And the second volume turned just 100 in 20 and 22. Spengler's work has not lost any relevance over the century that has passed since it was released, but rather has become increasingly significant. It is now one of the inseparable foundations of the philosophy of history. Many of the predictions concerning the fate of humanity, especially the distinction Spengler drew between culture and civilization, do not seem to contradict the major ideological, political, artistical, cultural, social, and economic trends of the present day. However, Spengler's other ideas, such as those concerning the supposed simultaneity of cultures and civilizations, right, the idea that we're all little oranges, separated almost as little universes, and the doctrine of analogy that can be drawn from them, have not stood the test of time and criticism, although the methodology Spengler used to develop his theory of cultural and civilizational analogies was under sharp attack from historians and philosophers already in his own day. It was common amongst historians when the work was first published to poke fun at certain of the author's insights, which some interpreted as misguided and superficial analogies between the spirituality of ancient civilizations and the worldview of modern man, or as an overly imaginative and free treatment of historical fact. But this does little to detract from the significance and value of Spengler's work as a whole. The Decline of the West, originally under the title, here we go again, Der Untergang des Alpenlandes, or The Fall of the West, was clearly not written to depict the past of humanity in precise detail, in a way that could be proven in the sense of natural scientific objectivity, but as an attempt to break with a dominant narrative. And in this respect, the work can be considered very successful. The most important feature of the political, social, philosophical message that it was completely at odds with the optimistic, progressive spirit that pervaded the philosophy of the 18th century history, such as Voltaire, Condorcet, Herder, Kant in Germany, the Whig narrative already mentioned, those of the 19th century, Hegel, Markham, Spencer, so-called Ranke school. It was Spengler who, after certain antecedents already mentioned, Vico, Nietzsche, Goethe, gave a powerful new formulation to the doctrine of historical cycles. The cyclical approach is one of the oldest European reflections on time and history. It was a dominant approach to thinking about history already before Christianity, but also in the Christian Middle Ages. In the Jewish and Christian tradition, cyclical thinking also appears in the book of Daniel concerning the prophetic destruction of world empires. It's not for nothing. I'm recording this in the beginning of December. It's not for nothing in the Catholic lectionary that Daniel appeared right before Advent, as do the books of Apocalypse and Maccabees. These are very historiographical texts in the Holy Bible that have a lot of resonance in later Western history. The idea of cyclicality, we continue, was already highlighted in the Greek mythology, historical tradition, such as the Hesiod, which was later joined by Plato, as well as Timaeus. This is one of the political equivalences of mythological thinking, which Spengler also drew on in the decline of the West, as well as in his explicitly socially oriented works. It is the so-called anacyclosis doctrine, the idea of alternation of government and state forms derived from Plato and Aristotle, which was developed in its most complete form by Polybius. According to this view, the history of various forms of government can be depicted as a process of decline and change. This is Plato's ages of gold, ages of silver, ages of bronze, rinse and repeat. From the emergence of a just king to the indeterminate and chaotic primordial state of society to the power of the debauched demagogue. This ultimately creates a state from which a leader capable of restarting the cycle, the Caesar, can emerge again. In this perspective, there is no linear progression, but only periods of decline and development. A leader or elite group or caste can ensure the flourishing of society, but there is no guarantee that humanity has a universal historical purpose or direction. And the present does not have a self-evident surplus of value over the past. Can you think of anything more shocking to an Enlightenment look at history? At any moment, it is conceivable that an achieved state will be destroyed, degenerate, or fall back into nothingness, since in infinite historical space and time, everything will be undone, as history has neither direction nor purpose. There is only creation and destruction, just as nature is constantly created and destroyed. Again, the historical analogy for Spengler. And it is only the forms, that transcendental world, or the patterns, there's your Plato, that are eternal. These primordial patterns standing above the world process are repeated again and again and again and leave a kind of imprint on time. Denzo Teteji, well, I give up. Deso, I don't know. You got it. Look at this guy. Your pronunciation is not any better than mine, so I don't want to hear it. This fella, his interpretation, Spengler's aim with his great work was above all to overturn the dominant Western Christian conception of history. The most important elements of this conception, which largely remain to this day, are linearity, thank you, linearity and the principle of development, and the teleological character of meaning, that history is going to a certain place. So that's for the Christians, that's the parousia, right? There's a second coming and a rebirth of the world. As Spengler puts it, when the ideal and full richness of inner potentiality is fulfilled and realized in the external, then culture suddenly becomes rigid, withers, its blood coagulates, its forces break, it becomes civilization. So you move from culture broadly in the first half of a civilization or of an orange, you move from culture into civilization. Externally, the external spirit of the people, by the time you get to the second half, the civilizational phase, it is ossified. That is to say, the internal spirit of the people has accrued for them different resources, including material wealth, and that they have been able to leave this chrysalis, or this, how do you say for an insect or a snake? What do you say when the exoskeleton, right? When you move into the civilizational second half of a civilizational cycle for Spengler, the internal spirit is ebbing away, it's dying, and he has different ways to prove that, including the rise of the wealth power as a sign of great degeneracy for Spengler, the rise and the shifting of the focus from the countryside into the city is another example of degeneracy of a people's spirit. But conversely, and this is why it's hard to figure out where one is in these cycles, not the least of which for Spengler, these things take hundreds and sometimes thousands of years to play out. I think for him, a secula is like 1,000 years for a civilization to run through a full course. But part of that discernment and difficulty is the fact that when you move into the civilizational sphere, it appears that everything is as robust as it ever has been, and it will continue getting more robust. Right. So, for instance, to use just the American example, I'm near New York City. The spirit of, I guess, the people from how do you say, Holland? Yeah, the Dutch, who settled New York, and then the English and whatever people formed there. There was something about their spirit and their focus and their Geist, to use Hegel's idea. Something about the way those people saw the world and the spirit that got them moving, that produced what we call New York City. And New York City now has a tremendous infrastructure, maybe not a tremendous traffic infrastructure, but it's impressive in its own way. Maybe it's not efficient. That's the word I'm walking around, but it has big buildings. It never goes to sleep, whatever, right? I mean, there's something that has produced this peculiar settlement at the end of the Hudson River. And yet for Spengler, by the time you get to the big buildings and the trains and the razzle-dazzle of Times Square, the spirit of the people that produce that is gone. What you're left with is the husk, or the chrysalis, or the exoskeleton of a people that are effectively dead, not physically dead, but spiritually dead. However, the externality continues. Now, for Spengler, in these cycles, and they go for a long time, about 1,000 years, for Spengler, what can also happen is you can enter the Fellaheen stage of history, where you have the external exoskeleton, to use the natural simile, you have the externality of the civilization continuing. The internality, the spirit, is dead as a doornail, but it just goes on. It goes on and on. So the Fellaheen, I understand, is an Arabic word for peasant. So you have the peasantry of Egypt that have inherited not just ancient Egypt, but for Spengler, what he would consider the dead Arab culture. It still continues to function, though. At the time Spengler is writing, there's still the Caliphate, for instance. There's still the Ottoman Empire, right? And yet the glory days have long gone, but the Ottoman Empire for Spengler's time, the Fellaheen in Egypt, which was still nominally under Ottoman control, they're still going, and the British, who actually own Egypt by 1900, they're letting the Ottomans kind of carry on with this mythology. Or Byzantium, before the Ottomans, for that instance, you had another Fellaheen civilization of Byzantium, which was the husk of Rome, completely bereft of its original spirit, according to Spengler, but that just goes on and continues operating as if it's Rome, almost like a zombie, until Islam comes, and that's that. And so for Spengler, you can have this dynamic where civilization continues for a long time, but what made it so, the soul, is gone. And he sometimes is filled up with something else, like a. And so for Spengler, for instance, that's Christianity in the West. So Christianity, this Semitic black and white thing with this monistic, willful Yahweh, this idea comes into Western Europe, and it's like a mold, like a Jello mold, and eventually the Semitic personality, doesn't translate very well to Western man, at least to most Western men. However, there's obviously a kind of a certain type that appeals to, which gets into my idea of the Reformation being a kind of a blowback of that Semitic tendency that does exist in the West, but it's a minor tendency. But for mainstream Catholic Christianity in the West, and to a certain extent the mainline Protestants, to use this idea of the mold, you have Semitic Christianity that comes into the West, and then that Semitic soul is not there. So you have a mold, and it's pumped in with all of this individualism and all of this what Spengler calls this Faustianism. And so for him, he's very interested in the color blue. And for instance, in the Madonna, she's always with a blue whipple, a blue veil. And for Spengler, this is a profound image of how he sees a lot of historical dynamics. So you literally have this Palestinian Jewish woman, historically Mary, and this individual becomes the archetype of the West, where it's the Semitic mold, and literally in the depictions of the Virgin, the blue, the horizon, very Western ideas that would be very confusing, probably, to the Virgin Mary, historically speaking. And yet for Spengler, that would be an idea of the mold. So bringing things together for these introductory remarks, let me just show you, I think, what are not only some of my favorite paintings, but also I think very indicative of Spengler's view of history. So I want you, for homework, one and all, to look up Thomas Cole's Cycle of Empire. It can be translated different ways, I guess. I guess you wouldn't have to, because he was a New York artist. Speaking of New York, I think it's called The Course of Empire. I think it's called the proper title. Yeah, here we go. The Course of Empire. PBS is telling me that's that's what it is, and that's actually kind of what I think it is. My old wet brain. But yeah, look this up. I've actually seen these in person. They're on the wall. They're huge. They're on the wall, all 5 of them, of the New York City Historical Society off of Central Park, which is well worth viewing. Not just the paintings, but the museum itself. Very dynamic museum. And you can see this, and these are not the full paintings. You can see on the, we'll say at 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock, the full paintings are not there, just for the thumbnail. But more or less, what I'm trying to see this seems to be going in a counterclockwise direction. So if you see the full paintings here, you have a very Sylvan, very primitive settlement, and then in the next painting, it's more developed, and you'll notice also a religious shrine. And this was painted 100 years before Spengler published his book. But I think as a visual, this is really encapsulating. If the oranges don't do it for you, this is another way of encapsulating. And this is all the story of human civilization, but it's not a singular thing. That's what makes Spengler different and almost Eastern in his understanding of history, is that these are all contained universes. And then you move to really actually here at noon, historic clock, the high point of civilization. Then at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock on the clock analogy, then you move to decay. And if you were to see this painting very close, you would see there's a lot of chaos here. Seems to be some military conquest. And then finally, at 2 o'clock, you can see you're back to the primitive. All you're left with are the husks of the civilization. And for Spengler, then you just rinse and repeat. And the story begins at the same time somewhere else. And 1,000 years later, it begins somewhere else. And it's the same thing over and over, just like animals or bugs. The only thing that makes the civilizations different are the spirits which cause them to set out on this journey. And so that takes accounting of different cultural artifacts like art and language and so forth, religion. Okay, so this again is the course of empire, and I would like you to take a look at that as a visual besides oranges. Okay, so we'll bring the bird down and get to uploading this and get ready for the next class. If you're interested in this, I encourage you to enroll in our next running of the Sons of Issachar course. And we have many other historical, literary, philosophical courses, and there are other things as well. We have a homeopathy course coming on in the new year, mathematics, Spanish is coming on, and other good things as well. Teacher training with Dr. Fisher as well. So all sorts of energies happening here at Apocatastasis. And if you want to get up to date on this particular course and hear some of our other introductory remarks and directions for your own private study, check out these earlier introductory classes. We're now on class 6 of 10, so there's plenty to wade through in terms of what on earth is happening to human civilization. It's not a new question to ask. The best minds in history, including bald old Oswald Spengler, agree and have given their insights. So we'll knock off with our oranges. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in class. Valete.